I've been alive for 80 years now. 80. That's a number that doesn't quite fit in your mouth, right, does it? I say it and I still don't believe it. Inside here, I'm still about 34, maybe 36 on a bad knee day, but 80 years. That means I've watched this world change more times than most people will ever get the chance to. I've seen things born and die, ideas, presidents, whole ways of living, and lately I've been thinking a lot about the people I grew up around, the ones born in the 60s and 70s, my kids' generation, some of my younger siblings, people I worked alongside for 40 years. Because I'll tell you something nobody seems to be saying out loud. That generation, the people who grew up in the 60s and 70s, they are not properly understood. Not by their own children, not by the media, not even, I think, by themselves half the time. And I've lived long enough to have some thoughts about why. So pull up a chair. I'm going to tell you what I saw, what I watched happen to those kids, and what I think it did to them. I was born in 1944, which means by the time the 60s really got going, I'm talking the mid-60s, 65, 66. I was already a young man. I had a wife. We were starting a family. My first daughter, Patricia, was born in 1963. My son, Robert, 1967. My youngest, Diane, 1971. So I didn't just read about what happened to kids born in those decades. I raised them. I watched it happen up close from the kitchen table, from the driver's seat of a station wagon, from the back porch on summer evenings. And what happened to those kids, it was unlike anything any generation before or since has experienced. Let me explain what I mean. When Patricia was born in 63, America was confident. That's the only word for it. We had just come through the war, my father's war, and we'd won. The economy was booming. People believed in things. They believed in the government. They believed in the church. They believed that if you worked hard and kept your nose clean, life would reward you. There was an order to things. And then, almost overnight, and I mean this, it felt like overnight, everything came apart. By the time my son Robert was old enough to understand the news, we'd had Kennedy shot. Then King, then Bobby Kennedy. The Vietnam War was on our television every single night. The actual war, the bodies, the burning villages, right there between the dinner table and the evening news. The summer of 68, there were riots in the streets of our own cities. I remember my wife pulling the curtains and saying, "What is happening to this country?" And I didn't have an answer. Now, here's what I need you to understand. Children absorb everything. They may not have the words for it. They may be playing with their toys in the next room, but they feel the anxiety in their parents' voices. They feel the tension at the dinner table. They feel the world being uncertain, even when the adults around them are trying to pretend it isn't. The children born in the 60s and 70s grew up in a world that was, in the deepest sense, coming unstitched. The old rules were being thrown out. The new rules hadn't been written yet. And nobody was preparing those kids for what that would do to their inner lives. My kids were what they later started calling latchkey kids. You probably know the term. It means you came home from school and let yourself in with a key around your neck because both parents were working. Now, in my case, my wife, Margaret, was home until the early 70s. But then things changed. Inflation hit hard, the oil crisis, prices went up and salaries didn't keep pace, And Margaret went back to work. Patricia was 12, Robert was 9, Diane was just 6. They came home to an empty house every day. And we told ourselves, like most parents did, that they were fine, they were capable, they could manage, and they could. That's the thing. They could manage. They became very good at managing. But managing is not the same as being okay. What those kids learned, what millions of kids in that era learned, is that they were essentially on their own, that the adults in their lives, even the loving ones, even the well-meaning ones like me, were unavailable, distracted, dealing with our own problems. And so they learned to be self-sufficient in ways that looked impressive from the outside, but created a kind of loneliness on the inside that I don't think has ever fully been named. They learned not to ask for too much. They learned not to make a fuss. They learned that their emotional needs were, at best, a secondary concern. And then they carried that into their adult lives, into their marriages, into how they raised their own children, into how they treated themselves. I want to talk about what this actually looks like in a person, because I've watched it for 60 years in my own children and in the people around them. The first thing, and I think this is the biggest one, is what I'd call a deep discomfort with needing people. My son Robert is 66 years old now, sharp as a tack, successful, proud man. And if you ask him how he's doing, he will say fine before you've even finished the sentence. Fine. Always fine. Even when his marriage was falling apart in his 50s, fine. Even when he had a health scare a few years back, fine. Even when I can see in his eyes that he's carrying something heavy, fine. That word, fine, that's not just a word for people of his generation. It's a fortress. It's a wall they built as children when showing vulnerability meant being a burden. And they kept building that wall brick by brick for 60 years. Until now it's so thick they sometimes can't get through it themselves. I asked Robert once, we were sitting right here actually a couple of winters ago, I said, "Son, what do you actually need right now?" He looked at me like I'd asked him in a foreign language. That's not a criticism of Robert. God, no. That boy is one of the finest men I know. But it broke my heart a little watching him sit there not knowing how to answer that question. Because somewhere along the way, the world taught him that what he needed didn't matter much. And that's not fine. That's a wound. The second thing I've noticed, and this runs through almost everyone I know from that generation, is a complicated relationship with authority. See, when my children were growing up, they watched the institutions that were supposed to be trustworthy destroy that trust one by one. Watergate, they watched a president resign in disgrace. Robert was 7 when Nixon left office. Diane was barely 3. The Catholic Church, and we were a Catholic family, started having its own shadows come to light. The military, Vietnam, boys coming home broken or not coming home at all, and being told to be quiet about it. Television showed them protests, showed them what happened when people stood up to authority. Sometimes the authority beat them with clubs on national television. So what does a child do with all of that? What do they build inside themselves when the grown-ups, the institutions, the systems, have proven themselves unreliable? They learn to be skeptical, sometimes healthy skepticism, the kind that makes you question things, think for yourself, not just accept what you're told. But sometimes, and this is the darker side, it becomes an inability to trust anything, anyone, any system, any relationship, any promise. I've watched this in people from that generation, a kind of baseline distrust that sits underneath everything that makes it hard to commit fully, to believe fully, to let their guard down fully, because the last time someone told them everything is fine and you can trust us, it wasn't, and they weren't. The third thing, and this one is close to my heart, is what I think of as a hidden grief. People born in the 60s and 70s grew up in a world that was changing so fast, so violently, that there was no time to mourn what was being lost. The old world, the stable, certain, ordered world, was disappearing. But nobody sat down and said, "Children, let's grieve this, let's acknowledge the loss." No, you just adapted. You kept moving. Crying was weakness. Sadness was self-indulgence. You put one foot in front of the other. My daughter Patricia, she's 61 now, went through a stretch in her early 50s where she started having what she described as a vague, constant sadness. Couldn't put her finger on it. Nothing was specifically wrong, but something felt unresolved. She started seeing a therapist. And what they eventually uncovered, this took time, I'll tell you, was that Patricia had been grieving, quietly, without permission, for most of her life. Grieving a childhood that felt unstable. Grieving parents, meaning me and Margaret, I'll own that, who were doing their best but were not emotionally present in the way she needed. Grieving a world that had asked her to grow up too fast and feel too little. When she told me this, I cried. First time I'd cried in probably 10 years, because I was the one who did that. Partly. And I didn't even know. Now. I've been talking about wounds, and I don't want to leave it there. Because if there's one thing that frustrates me about the way people discuss this generation, it's that they only ever get talked about as a problem, a lost generation, the forgotten generation, the cynical ones, the ones who can't open up. That's not the whole story, not even close. The people I raised, the people I watched come of age in the 60s and 70s, are some of the most resilient human beings I have ever encountered in 80 years of living. And I mean that in the deepest, truest sense of the word. Not resilient in the bumper sticker sense. The what doesn't kill you makes you stronger nonsense that gets thrown around. I mean genuinely, functionally, practically resilient. They know how to survive hard things because they had to. My son Robert, when the company he'd worked at for 20 years downsized and let him go at 52, didn't fall apart, didn't sit down and wait for someone to save him. Within 8 months, he had rebuilt his career in a completely new direction, from scratch. Was it easy? No. Did he struggle? I'm sure he did, though he'd never have told me. But he did it, because that generation was trained from childhood to handle difficulty without crumbling. They are extraordinarily competent, incredibly resourceful. They don't need to be told what to do or held by the hand. They figure things out, and they have a kind of quiet loyalty that is rare. When they commit to something, a job, a marriage, a friendship, they commit. None of this casual, 1 foot in, 1 foot out way of relating to things. If they're in, they're in. That comes from the same place as their self-sufficiency. But it's the beautiful side of it, and they're funny, Lord, are they funny? That's something nobody talks about, the humor that came out of people who grew up in those decades, dark, dry, sometimes absurdist, but real, earned. You can't watch what they watched. Watergate, Vietnam, assassinations, economic chaos, the nightly news as a horror movie, and come out the other side without developing a very particular sense of humor. It's armor, yes, but it's also genuine wit, a way of holding the world's absurdity at arm's length long enough to laugh at it before it crushes you. My children make me laugh, truly laugh, in ways that I think only people who've been through hard things together can really do. But here's what I think is the core of what nobody understands about this generation. They were raised in a world that was changing the rules, but nobody told them what the new rules were. Their parents, my generation, grew up with very clear instructions for how life worked. You get a job, you stay in that job. You get married, you stay married. You don't talk about feelings. You provide, you endure. That's it. Clear as a bell. Then the world started saying, through television, through music, through the cultural upheaval of the 60s, no, wait, it's actually about self-expression, about freedom, about questioning everything, about your feelings mattering. But the parents, again, people like me, we were already formed. We couldn't quite change. So we kept raising our kids mostly the way we'd been raised, even as the world around us was screaming something different. And those kids ended up caught between two worlds. They were told by the culture, your feelings matter, express yourself, be authentic. But they were shown by their actual daily lives, be quiet, be useful, don't be a burden, get on with it. So they internalized both messages simultaneously, and they've been living in that tension ever since. They know they're supposed to open up. The culture has told them that for 50 years now. But the wiring, the deep wiring that was laid down in childhood says, stay closed, manage it yourself, don't ask for too much. And that internal conflict, knowing what you should feel able to do, but being unable to do it, that creates a kind of quiet suffering that is very hard to explain to people who didn't live through it. My Patricia described it once. She said, Dad, it's like being told to swim, but having never been taught. You know swimming is possible. You've seen people swim. But every time you get near the water, your body says you'll drown. And you can't always figure out where that terror comes from. If I could go back, and I think about this more than I probably should at my age, there are things I would do differently with my children. I would tell them more that their feelings were welcome, not embarrassing, not inconvenient, welcome. I would have asked more questions and given fewer instructions. I would have been present in a different way, not just physically in the house, but present. Looking up from the newspaper, putting down the worry about money long enough to really sit with them. Because what children need, what those children needed, born in that chaotic, uncertain, beautiful, broken era, is for someone to say, I see you. I know this is hard. You don't have to manage this alone. Most of them never heard that, not clearly enough, not consistently enough. And so they became adults who are incredibly capable of managing everything alone, because they had to, but who carry somewhere underneath all that capability a child who is still waiting to be told it's okay to need something. Now, I'm aware that the world has changed enormously since then. My grandchildren are growing up in a world that talks about feelings constantly. Mental health is on the news. Therapy is no longer shameful. Young people say, I need a mental health day, and nobody blinks. And part of me, the modern part, the part that's listened and learned, thinks that's wonderful. Truly. But I'll be honest with you, there's a part of the people born in the 60s and 70s that sometimes looks at all of that and feels not quite connected to it, like they're watching a conversation being had in a room they were never invited into. A conversation they needed 50 years ago being had by people who came after them. And that creates its own particular loneliness, the loneliness of being too old to fully participate in the new emotional vocabulary, and too young to have had the old certainties that at least told you where you stood. They're in a kind of no man's land. And I think that's why so many of them feel misunderstood, not because people don't care about them, but because the generational conversation has moved on. First to the baby boomers and all their enormity, Then to millennials and Gen Z and their very real struggles, and the people in between got quietly overlooked again, just like they were as children coming home to an empty house. I want to speak directly now to anyone watching this who was born in the 60s or 70s. I'm 80 years old. I've watched you your whole lives. Some of you I raised. Some of you I worked alongside. Some of you I've known in passing and recognized the way you recognize a certain kind of person, because you've seen that particular look in their eyes before, that look that says, I'm fine, when they're not, that says, I can manage when they're barely holding it. I see you. I want you to know something that maybe nobody has said to you clearly enough or recently enough. You were not too much. You were not a burden. The fact that you needed more than you got, that wasn't your fault. That was the era. That was the circumstances. That was the limits of the people around you, including people like me who loved you but didn't always know how to show it in the ways you needed. Your self-sufficiency is genuinely impressive. Don't let anyone take that from you. The way you get things done, the way you endure, the way you show up even when you're running on empty, that is real strength. But I also want to say this. You are allowed at this stage of your life, whether you're 55 or 65 or 70, you are allowed to put some of that armor down. You are allowed to say, I need something. You are allowed to say, I'm not fine, I haven't been fine, and I'd like to talk about it. Not because weakness is strength, not because vulnerability is some kind of trendy value, but because you have been carrying things quietly, competently, alone for long enough, and you deserve to set some of it down. One more thing before I finish. The people born in the 60s and 70s are now in their 50s, 60s, and early 70s. They are at the age where they are becoming the elders, the grandparents, the ones the young people look to. And I think they carry something that is genuinely precious, something the younger generations desperately need and don't always know they're missing. They carry the memory of a world without the internet, a world where you had to be bored, where you had to figure things out without a device in your hand, where connection meant actual physical presence. They carry the memory of endurance, of what it feels like to go through something genuinely hard and come out the other side without it having been processed into content or shared on a platform. They carry a kind of unpolished, unperformed authenticity. They're not great at branding themselves. They don't always know how to make their lives look good on camera. But they know how to live, how to sit with discomfort, how to maintain dignity through difficulty. Those are gifts, real, rare, needed gifts. And my hope at 80 years old, sitting in this chair with my coffee going cold, my hope is that this generation starts to recognize the value of what they carry, starts to pass it on consciously, starts to have the conversations they were never able to have with each other. Because what happened to you, the chaos, the uncertainty, the independence that was thrust upon you before you were ready, the love that was real but not always fluent, that shaped you into something worth understanding. And it's not too late to be understood.